Today, we are diving deep into a truly landmark verdict, the 2022 judgment on the downing of Flight MH17. Now, this is a ruling that was literally years in the making, and it has massive implications for how we even define justice in modern conflicts. So let's get into how the court managed to piece this whole thing together.
It all started on July 17th, 2014. That's when Malaysia Airlines flight MH17 was blown out of the sky over eastern Ukraine. There were no survivors. In just one moment, 298 people, men, women, children, lost their lives. Okay, now let's fast forward through years of painstaking investigation to a Dutch courtroom. The verdict finally comes down. You have three men, Jurkin, Dubinsky, and Harshenko, found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But then a fourth, Politov, was acquitted. So how on earth did the court come to such drastically different conclusions for these men? Well, that's exactly what we're here to deconstruct.
So here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with the court's core conclusion about what actually happened to the plane. Then, we're going to dig into the legal groundwork that made this trial even possible. After that, we'll analyze the specific roles each suspect played, and this is really the key to the whole verdict. And finally, we'll zoom out and look at why this judgment matters so much, far beyond this one case.
So let's start at the end with the final verdict. This was a decision delivered on November 17th, 2022, after a long, incredibly complex legal process.
You see, before the court could even begin to assign blame, it had to establish the facts. It had to answer the most fundamental question of all: what exactly happened to Flight MH17?
And after weighing just a mountain of evidence, the court's conclusion was definitive. There was no room for doubt. This wasn't an accident, it wasn't a bomb on board, and it wasn't another plane. The judges ruled, unequivocally, that MH17 was shot down by a Buk surface-to-air missile fired from a mobile launcher known as a Buk teller.
And the court got incredibly specific. It wasn't just any Buk missile, it was one fired from a particular farm field near a town called Pervomaisky. And, crucially, the judges confirmed that this area was under separatist control at the time. Now, here's a really important legal point. The court said that when you fire a weapon like this at an airplane, you inherently intend to kill everyone on board. That becomes a key piece of the puzzle.
So, establishing what happened was the first huge step. But then came the legal hurdles. And there's a big one right at the start. How did a Dutch court even get the authority to try a crime that was committed over Ukraine? Well, it all comes down to a legal concept called jurisdiction. The court's power here really stood on two pillars. First, a large number of the victims were Dutch citizens. And second, there was an international agreement that essentially allowed the Netherlands to take over the prosecution from Ukraine. This gave the Dutch court the authority to seek justice for every single victim, no matter their nationality.
Okay, but hang on a minute. This all happened in a war zone, right? So that brings up another huge legal question. Weren't these guys just soldiers? Shouldn't they be protected by something called combatant immunity? Combatant immunity is what normally keeps soldiers from being prosecuted for, lawful acts of war. But in this case, the court said, no, it doesn't apply here. And why not? Because for that immunity to kick in, the armed group they belonged to had to be under the overall control of a state. The court looked at the evidence and concluded it just wasn't there. And that decision is huge. It meant these men would be tried as civilians under criminal law, not as soldiers. And that brings us right to the heart of the verdict: how the court figured out who was responsible for what. This is where the legal reasoning gets super detailed and, honestly, pretty fascinating.
First off, the court had to tackle a pretty major defense argument. What if they thought they were shooting at a military plane? The court's answer was crystal clear. It doesn't matter. Since they had no legal right to shoot down any aircraft, military or civilian, mistaking the target was completely irrelevant. The act itself, the intent to bring down a plane and kill its occupants, was the crime. A mistake about who the victims were doesn't get you off the hook. So how do you hold people responsible when none of them actually pushed the launch button? The court used two really important legal ideas. You have the co-perpetrator, who plays a direct, essential, hands-on role. But then you have the functional perpetrator. This is someone higher up the chain. They might not be on the ground, but they have the power to decide if the crime happens, and they accept the consequences. Understanding this difference is absolutely vital to understanding the final verdict. And here's exactly how the court applied those concepts. Gürkin, as the top military commander, was a functional perpetrator. He had the ultimate authority.
Dubinsky and Karchenkov, on the other hand, were co-perpetrators because they played essential, direct roles in deploying the book launcher. But Politov, he was acquitted. The court found that he didn't have a direct, essential role, and crucially, he didn't have the authority to either approve or cancel the launch. For him, that legal chain of responsibility was broken.
Okay, so let's zoom out. Beyond the life sentences and the one acquittal, what's the lasting impact here? Why does a single judgment matter so much? Well, first, it's a massive step for accountability. It sends a clear message that even in the chaos of war, individuals can still be held responsible. For the families of those 298 victims, it's an official judicial acknowledgement of the truth, and it's backed by an award of over 16 million euros in damages. And on a global level, this verdict sets an incredibly powerful precedent for how complex international crimes can be prosecuted in national courts. And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. This verdict was about so much more than one flight or 4 men. It was a test case for justice in our modern world of hybrid warfare and shadowy armed groups. The real question now is, how will this landmark decision shape the fight for international justice in the even more complex conflicts that lie ahead?